Welcome, grace and peace to you, and thank you for tuning in to this third installment of the Book of Jonah. Because we'll be covering a lot of ground today, I won't be summarizing where we've been so far. So if you haven't watched this video, or this one either, I suggest you do before moving forward with this one. Now, for those up to speed, let's pick it up with chapter 1, verse 7. Jonah, chapter 1, verses 7 through 16. And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us, on whose account this evil has come upon us? What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. When we left the story last time, the polytheist sailors had determined that the unusual storm that had suddenly overtaken them was no ordinary storm, but instead the reaction of an unknown God for some grave sin that someone on board had committed. The problem for the sailors was that even after praying to all their gods and hurling the cargo into the sea, the indignation of the unknown God had not been appeased. Therefore, despite their best efforts, the sea still raged, and their lives hung in the balance. And so, in verse 7, finally the sailors got together and said, "Let's ask our gods to show us who caused all this trouble." In this case, the crew did so by casting lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Of course, after learning that Jonah was somehow involved, the crew urgently asked him a series of questions to quickly learn what they needed to do to be saved. The sailors hoped their questions, "Where do you come from? What is your country? And of what people are you?" will give them the answers as to which God was responsible for the unusual storm. After all, in the ancient Near East, a person's religion went hand in hand with their nationality. But let's not forget the sailors' very first question to Jonah here in verse 8. What is your occupation? Many commentators believe this question was probably like a cold hard slap to Jonah's face, a painful reminder of his disobedience and betrayal of God and his calling. With this in mind, it's worth noting that the dialogue in biblical narratives often reveals the heart of the story, and the heart, or essential part to the 1:4 through 16 passage, comes to us in verse 9, when Jonah answers the sailors' questions. Of course, Jonah is brief and to the point, and he only seems to answer the sailors' last question directly. So let's take a moment and break down Jonah's 4-point response to the sailors' questions. First point, Jonah answers the sailors' last question first. I am a Hebrew. This is how the Israelites identified themselves to foreigners at this time. The second point is, and I fear the Lord. This is Jonah's statement of faith, so to speak, although Jonah's behavior doesn't suggest he has any. He does not fear God the way the Gentile sailors do. Moreover, the English word translated here as fear is taken from the Hebrew term yara, and yara can mean to fear, to revere, or to worship, depending on the context. In the 1:4 through 16 passage, yara appears in verses 5, 9, 10, and 16. Since the fear of the Lord leads to obedience, and since Jonah is in fact a disobedient runaway prophet, I suggest, and I worship the Lord, to be a better translation here. Because what Jonah is actually doing is professing his theological loyalty to Yahweh, the one true God of Israel. His point is to contrast himself with the Phoenician sailors who worshipped many false gods. However, it's unfortunate that although Jonah is proud of his occupation and theological orthodoxy, he is hopelessly oblivious to the fact that his behavior betrays his occupation and religion. Third point, the phrase, the God of heaven. This must be understood in light of the other 2 points, I am a Hebrew, I worship the Lord, the God of heaven. Again, Jonah is making a clear distinction between Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, and all the other fake gods of the ancient Near East. Unlike the sailors' gods, who were believed to be personifications of the forces of this world, hence they were part of the material universe, Yahweh is other. Thus, he is enthroned over creation. And to segue into point number 4, he made the sea and dry land. Jonah's point here to the sailors is that Yahweh holds the sea and all those who sail upon it in the palm of his hand. Moving on to verse 10, as the full weight of Jonah's response begins to settle in, the sailors' fear escalates. The captain and his crew are overwhelmed by the cosmic nature and power of Jonah's God. For Yahweh is not merely a local deity, but he is the creator who stands above and apart from the physical universe. And as such, he can manipulate his created order at will to accomplish whatever he will. In addition, Jonah's confession only frustrates and horrifies the sailors further. What is this that you have done? Or, how could you have done such a thing? It's clear the Gentile sailors realize the magnitude of Jonah's sin. But the question is, does Jonah? Moving forward to verse 11, now that the sailors know that it's the wrath of Jonah's God that is reflected in the worsening storm, no less for his shocking disobedience, they ask Jonah what must be done to him to appease the Lord and quiet the storm. Jonah's response in verse 12 corresponds with the captain's command in verse 6. Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish. Jonah doesn't make that prayer back in verse 6, and he certainly doesn't make it here in verse 12 either. Perhaps the only bright spot, if you're an ancient Israelite hearing or reading Jonah's story for the very first time, is that Jonah's indifference gives way to guilt. Jonah knows he is responsible for the violent storm, that his choices have put everyone on board's life at risk. Moreover, he seems to be resigned to his fate, ready to accept judgment. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul that sins shall die. And so Jonah instructs the crew to hurl him into the sea. But Jonah's suggestion seems so repulsive to the men that they take matters into their own hands. Perhaps the sailors believed if they could just row Jonah back to shore, he could then be an obedient prophet, resume his mission, and appease the wrath of his God. However, it doesn't take long before the crew realizes human efforts alone are not going to save them. Therefore, they called out to the Lord. Notice that verse 14 mirrors verse 5, except this time the sailors cry out to the one true God. They now have a newfound appreciation for the power of Jonah's God, and so they pray the prayer that Jonah refused to pray. Of course, the sailors do not wish to perish, and at the same time, they realize they are but tools in the Lord's hands, and the ever-worsening storm and the lot that fell on Jonah are empirical signs that point to the Lord's will. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Looking closely at the text, we can see that verse 15 is the counterpart to verse 4. Remember, verse 4 records the consequences of Jonah's choice to reject the path God intended for him. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. So the sailors picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. The Lord answers the Gentile sailors' prayers and honors their genuine, though awkward, attempt at obedience by calming the sea, a clear sign to the men that Yahweh is the supreme God and the ultimate power in the universe. Of course, the Gentile sailors' response to the saving grace of God resembles what one might expect from pious Israelites during this time. And I suggest this is precisely what the author wanted his first audience to consider, because God's plan to remedy the effects of sin and draw humanity to himself was now on course to break into uncharted seas, meaning God's loving kindness, grace, compassion, and mercy are intended for all his human creatures, and not just an elite select few. A lesson, it seems, Jonah will have to learn the hard way. As we bring this section of the Book of Jonah to a close, remember, when we began our journey, I quoted G. Campbell Morgan's sentiments that men have been looking so hard at the great fish that they have failed to see the great God. I hope by now you have gathered that the purpose of Jonah's book isn't so much about telling a story about Jonah's incident with the really big fish as it is about telling people about God's loving kindness, grace, compassion, and mercy. For those of us living in the world today, if we could just see through all the bitter pessimism and resentment aimed at God, then perhaps we could discover that Jonah's story intends to bring us closer to God. And one of the things we learn about God from Jonah's story is that everybody is somebody in the eyes of the Lord. Even those somebodies like you and me, who are so much like Jonah, it hurts. Of course, if God loves us, and you and I are more like Jonah than we care to admit, then I might have some bad news, depending on how you see it. Because in the backside of Jonah's story, we're going to learn that God doesn't intend on leaving Jonah as he is. God's going to teach Jonah a lesson. And in case you haven't heard, transforming the human will is painful, perhaps more painful than even death. On that happy note, I look forward to seeing you next time as we continue our journey through the book of Jonah. And by the way, we'll get to that mother of all fish stories in the next episode. May God bless and keep you until then. Feel free to take part in the discussion in the comments section down below. And don't forget to like and share. And if you haven't done so, please consider subscribing. Thank you.